Bonsoir tout le monde. Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Catherine Spencer-Ross, Chair of Heritage Ottawa's Lecture Series Committee. It is with great pleasure that I welcome you to our March lecture, which will take us to rural Ottawa for a refreshing break, thanks to our speaker, Barbara Bottriell. Carolyn Quinn, a former president of Heritage Ottawa and currently Vice President Communications, will come on after the presentation and will moderate the questions and then close our event. Our lecture series is made possible through the generosity of our sponsor, Andrix Holdings, Inc. and Sandy Smallwood. Andrix has been a faithful sponsor of these lectures, as well as of our walks and some publications. We are also grateful for the operations grant from the City of Ottawa and a heritage grant from the province of Ontario. I'd also like to thank those of you who have made donations to Heritage Ottawa and encourage this very concrete form of support. Your contributions enable us to speak up for heritage properties at risk of demolition or inappropriate redevelopment. I encourage you to join Heritage Ottawa if you are not yet a member and to make a financial contribution to the organization. Please connect with our website for information. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Barbara Bottriell. Barbara graduated from McMaster University with a degree in English and French literature, and then studied civilization and local history in France for a year at an institute associated with the Université d'Aix-Marseille. Barbara is a former magazine writer, contributing to notable publications such as Chatelaine, Maclean's, the Globe and Mail, and the Old Star Weekly. As a radio broadcaster, she provided freelance material to CBC Radio over a number of years in Toronto and had a weekly column for Radio Noon here in Ottawa, as well as doing pieces for In Town and Out on Saturday mornings. She is the author of 3 local history books, the former president of Goulburn Township Historical Society, and a board member of Heritage Ottawa. She received the Sovereign's Medal for volunteering from the Governor General in 2017 and was chosen as the Roger Griffiths Memorial Citizen of the Year in 2016 in Stittsville. Barbara has a love of history and heritage and lives in a heritage house built in 1904 in rural Ottawa. Her interest in Fitzroy was sparked during the pandemic as she and her husband explored different regions of Ottawa since they couldn't travel very far during that time. Research has resulted in a fascinating trove of built heritage and natural landscapes, which brings us to this evening's presentation. And with that, Barbara, the floor is yours.
It's a pleasure to be with you tonight, and I hope that you're going to enjoy discovering the treasures in rural Ottawa just as much as I did when I was discovering them. The presentation tonight is a little different in that I have pre-recorded it. So you will hear me during the presentation, but you won't see me. At least you shouldn't be able to see me. But I will be back in person after the presentation is over to take part in the question and answer session. Back in 2001, the old regional municipality of Ottawa-Carleton fell by the wayside and re-emerged as the new City of Ottawa. By doing so, Ottawa gained a tremendous amount of land, going from 110.5 square kilometers to 2,778 square kilometers. In fact, it is larger in size than Vancouver, Montreal, Toronto, Edmonton, and Calgary combined. I did find this hard to believe, but apparently it's true. Large it may be, but Ottawa's population is very low, and that's because most of the land the City of Ottawa gained was rural. Even those who live in Ottawa do not necessarily know the rural parts of the city. They may venture out to an NCC area that might be new to them, but like most of the tourists who come to visit the city, They aren't familiar with the rural villages or the countryside that make the city, and they don't realize that there are heritage treasures to be found in the rural areas. Considering how big the rural area is, I guess we're going to have to narrow our search somewhat, but it's useful to see just what areas Ottawa does cover before we set off on our journey. We can see the old city of Ottawa, or the one we used to know, the red parts, then all the new parts that have been added: Torbolton and Fitzroy, March and Huntley, Goulburn, Marlborough, North Gore, Nepean, Osgood, Gloucester, and Cumberland. Where I want to take you is to the west, to the old township of Fitzroy, which is bounded on the north by the Ottawa River and to the south by Lanark County. The township was named after Charles Fitzroy, son-in-law of the Duke of Richmond, and one of Wellington's aides-de-camp during the Battle of Waterloo. I chose this area because it has many houses that were built in the 1800s, which are still occupied today. Some have retained their original look, and some have been converted with siding, but the fact is, they are still lived in today, and they reflect the pioneer heritage that is distinct to this part of Eastern Ontario. The built heritage of Fitzroy Township tells the story of the way of life that existed in earlier times, and that still exists in some ways today. The first thing you notice as you head out into the countryside is the big sky. The landscape is spread out in front of you on both sides of the road. There are no tall buildings. There is a sense of peace as your eye ranges over the brown earth of cultivated land in the spring and the green of corn or soybeans as the seasons progress. There used to be 6 or 7 villages in Fitzroy Township, and one of them was Antrim. It more or less disappeared after 1963, when the general store, which was the heart of the community, was obliterated by the building of Highway 17. But the name lives on in a lovely little white church located at the corner of Old Highway 17 and Kinburn Side Road. St. John's Anglican Church, Antrim, was built in 1873 by Robert Surson and his brother Jacob. It stands out as a landmark in the surrounding countryside. It has been lovingly kept in good shape by parishioners all these years, and it still serves a loyal congregation today. The simple style of the church is a reflection of the Gothic Revival architecture that was popular in the late 19th century in Ontario. Its stained glass window is a reminder of what small amounts of money and big efforts can do. To raise funds for the window, the Sunday school superintendent of the time gave each child 20 cents to buy some duck, geese, and turkey eggs, which they then hatched, raised, and later sold. The resulting funds paid for the new window, which was dedicated in 1893. If we continue on to the village of Kinburn, we'll be visiting one of the 3 villages that are left in the township of Fitzroy. Kinburn is situated right in the middle of the old township, and although it was settled as early as 1830, it slowly, and its post office wasn't established until 1856. It was a center for the surrounding agricultural land, and the homes that people built were pretty substantial, so the inhabitants must have been able to make a comfortable living. One of the earliest homes associated with Kinburn is a stone house built in 1833 by Captain Thomas Fraser, a United Empire Loyalist. He is considered the founder of Kinburn, and he received military land grants when he arrived. Contemporary owners have restored the house to its original state, and because of that, the former township of West Carleton, of which Fitzroy was a part, designated this home as a heritage building under the Provincial Heritage Act in 2000. The property also has a beautiful heritage barn on it, which appears to be still in very good shape. There are several other homes of historical and architectural interest in Kinburn. Here's a brick house that used to be known as Cloverdale Farm, and it was built around 1890 and it exhibits that combination of Victorian style with the rounded bay window and the pointed roof that became popular in Ontario around this time. An example of a frame house built in Kinburn is this 1.5-story home that was built in the 1890s. It doesn't show any of the fancy trim that often decorates Victorian buildings, but rather sticks to a Gothic Revival cottage style. Wood shiplap siding was added shortly after the house was built. Now, shiplap, not surprisingly, was originally used in ships, and it's a type of wood paneling with grooves top and bottom of each board so that it fits tightly together and provides a waterproof covering. The house has a tin roof that it's been painted. It was probably installed around 1900. An attractive but unusual house is found on Loggers Way in Kinburn. It's unusual because it is white and would likely be taken for a frame house. In fact, it is brick, built in 1876, and covered with vinyl siding in the 1980s. Its style is Gothic Revival, but it has the bay window and the triple gable of Victorian architecture. Although the building doesn't exist anymore, Kinburn was famous for a log structure called the Swamp Tavern. Built by Christopher Armstrong in 1830, it was the only place you could buy liquor between Bytown and Arnprior. The tavern lasted well into the 1850s and was a popular stopping place for the boys employed in keeping the dust down on the road to Arnprior. It also generated a story about a swamp angel told in both the Carleton Saga and the Fitzroy Historical Society's Beyond Our Memory. It seems that there were a lot of wolves around in those days, and one night a young lady was frightened by the wolves and she climbed into a tree to be safe. Her cries of distress were heard by some of the local men, and they came to her rescue. The young lady rather enjoyed the experience, and she thought she'd like to try it again. So, a few nights later, up in the tree she went with the cries of distress as before. But when the men arrived to rescue her, they found no wolves, and so she became known as the Swamp Angel. Leaving the swamps behind, we can head over to Diamondview Road. There were unfortunately no diamonds in the area to cause this name to be given. Instead, it was the silver tongue of a local man who convinced his neighbors that since he had secured the post office for what was then a post village, it should be named after his birthplace of Diamond, County Antrim, Ireland. And although the village has disappeared, the road name remains, and it has a number of interesting buildings on it. First up is the Diamond Methodist Church. It was built in 1865 and it cost $900 to build. It's a 45 by 35 rectangular wooden church in Gothic Revival style with its pointed arched windows. It had ash pews and original plaster still on its walls. The church is no longer in use, but it is a designated heritage building, and a cemetery service is held every year in June. Just down the road is another church, St. Paul's Anglican Church. How proud the residents of the surrounding countryside must have been when it was built, for the grand ceremony that accompanied its opening created quite a stir in the community. It was a cold day in November of 1887 when the inaugural service took place, but records tell us that the church was packed and the Bishop of Ottawa was there, as well as the incumbent, Reverend J.F. Snowden, who had actually designed the church. In fact, 54 candidates were presented for confirmation on that day. which tells you how important this church and this occasion was to the people who lived in the area. The church was built with hand-hewn blocks of dark limestone, transported from a nearby quarry. A Gothic arch framed the entry to the choir and the altar, and the dark stained pine ceiling was reinforced by oak beams. There were 3 magnificent stained glass windows over the altar, and the chancel was carpeted throughout. Among the guests from Perth, Richmond, and the countryside was Mrs. Billings of Billings Bridge, who contributed a hand-embroidered altar cloth trimmed with plush gold. The total cost of the building was $3,000, and all but a few dollars were raised by donation. But despite its bright beginnings, a decline in the local population led to regular services being stopped in 1982, and it is now a private residence. Further on down Diamondview Road, we come to a lovely stone house built in 1839 or 1840. Its architecture is Ontario cottage style, with the single central gable. It was said to be built by a man named Thomas Green, who would have been one of the early settlers in the area. Note the matching lintel stonework above all the windows and the entrance door. The stonework is very smooth, and the contrasting corner joints are decorative as well as providing the necessary strength for the building. Almost next door, in country terms, is another exceptional stone house built in 1858. It was built from local quarried limestone, and you can see that it's a bit rougher looking than the one we just saw. A 2-story porch was added by later owners, but was removed by subsequent owners who wanted an entrance more in keeping with the 1858 style of entrance. Apparently, the restoration was modeled on a house of that period in Kingston, Ontario. The owners kept most of its original external and internal moldings and its glass windows. It was designated as a heritage structure, first by Fitzroy Township and then by the Township of West Carleton. Next comes the Eastman Farm, which was established in 1833 according to the Century Farm sign on its front lawn. The date is a little hard to see, but it is there. But the house we see today wasn't built until around 1870 by John Early. A summer kitchen and shed were built in the 1880s, and white vinyl siding added in 1998 in place of the previous clapboard. The Early family lived in the house first, and then sold it to the Eastman family, and at least 3 generations of Eastmans have continued to occupy this house. It's a 1.5-story frame house, which became popular in Fitzroy Township from the 1870s onwards. Leaving the Diamondview Road, we can head to the village of Galetta. It owes its existence to a very pretty waterfall on the Mississippi River, which provided highly valued water power, first to the pioneers and then to later arrivals. The village started out being called Steen's Falls after the first settler, James Steen, who built a sawmill in the 1830s and logged white pine along the river. Then a man named James Hubble set up a business and renamed the village Hubble's Falls in 1849. Finally, a third man arrived, Mr. J.G. White, who set up a large woolen mill in the 1870s, and he renamed the village after his mother, whose first name was Galetta. White's influence must have been the strongest, because the village has retained the name Galetta ever since. The Mississippi continued to provide water power to the township when the Galetta Electric Dam and Power Station was established in 1907. It still provides power today and is owned and operated by TransAlta. Right across from the power station is this 1.5-story frame house built around 1879 by Galetta White, mother of the woolen mill man, J.G. White. It's simpler than the Ontario cottage style, which always has a gable in the center of its roof. This style of house, of which there are many examples in Fitzroy Township, is a straightforward rectangular shape with a sharply peaked, shingled roof. It was easy to build, and it became popular once those sawn timbers became common and large sawmills could provide the lumber. Its original owner was Maynard McLean, who later became chief operator of the Galetta Power Company, so the house was very convenient to the power station and the dam. A rear summer kitchen and a shed were added in the 1880s, along with tongue-and-groove pine siding. It was awarded a century designation by West Carleton in 2000. Next door was built a little closer to the end of the century in 1893. The tin roof does need painting, but otherwise it's in good shape. Apparently there are 6 doors in the old kitchen. This house exhibits the way older houses have been adapted to more modern inhabitants. The research done by the Fitzroy Township Historical Society indicates that a 1.5-story addition was added to the rear about 1982, and that vinyl siding was installed in the late 1980s. This house was also awarded a century designation in 2000 by the Township of West Carleton. Next to it is a fine 2-story brick house built for the Anglican Diocese of Ottawa in 1903. Its solid rectangular style became more common in Fitzroy Township in the early 1900s. A summer kitchen was built soon after the house was built. The summer kitchen was usually fairly simple in design, and it was used to keep the heat from the cooking as well as the smells out of the main house in warm weather. This 1.5-story frame house on a side street in Galetta is distinctive because of its bright red roof. It was built in the 1880s, and tongue-and-groove pine siding was also applied at that time. Its Gothic revival in style, with its narrow front and peaked roof, with an attached veranda and the rest of the house built behind. Almost every road you drive along in Fitzroy Township provides you with a chance to see a house that's either architecturally or historically interesting. It's quite amazing. Some are on hidden small roads and some are on main roads. On Donald B. Munro Drive, for instance, there's this beautiful example of a neo-Gothic Victorian brick house built in 1876. Originally built by a man named Robert Armstrong, it seems to have stayed in the Armstrong family for a number of generations, and it was designated as a century home by the local Architectural Conservation Advisory Committee in 2000. It's not uncommon for special homes like this to be passed down from generation to generation in this township. Upper Dwyer Hill Road has quite a few brick houses. According to Willis Gourlay, who was a key contributor to the Fitzroy Historical Society's book on heritage homes, brick clay was found in the township sometime during the 1880s, and large brick homes then became popular. This red brick house was one of the first to be built, but it did burn down and then was rebuilt in the same style by its owner, William Shannon. Its simple style and hip roof are typical of the 1890s and the early 1900s. A house that has historical as well as architectural interest is this lovely home hidden away on John Shaw Road. It's called Avonmoor, and the farm has been owned by the Gourlay family since 1803, although the present house wasn't built until 1892. It's a log and frame house that later had stucco applied to its exterior. It's neo-Gothic in style, but the arches of its veranda have echoes of Spanish and Moorish style. The Gourlay family received a century plaque from the Township of West Carleton in 2000. Something that surprised me in this journey was the number of stone houses that were built in Fitzroy Township. It speaks to the workmanship of stone masons, many of whom were either of Scottish origin or Irish immigrants who had worked on the Rideau Canal. This home was built by Robert and Margaret Dixon in 1855 with stone quarried from the next construction over. The additions have not disturbed the beauty of the original stone home.
and it is still owned by the Dixon family today, over 160 years in the same family. This two-story gem was built around 1856 or 1857 by Joseph and Elizabeth Gilchrist. Its second floor was not added until the 1950s. It has stone lintels above its door and each of its windows, and the roof and dual chimneys that are typical of Ontario cottage style. The last example of a stone house to show you was built much later than these others. It was built by Edmund Wilson in 1891, and there have been no additions since. It is obviously a large house and seems to have remained in very good condition. Among the many treasures in Fitzroy Township are log houses. Some are now covered up by siding, but there are still a few that are in their original form. They're very special items to see. One such is this 1.5-story home on Newtown Road. It's a dirt road and there are not a lot of houses on it, but nestled near the end of it is this beautifully kept log home. It was built in the 1850s by the original owner, George Sadler, and his wife, Anne. The old tin roof has been replaced, and the logs have been rechinked, and new windows have been added. On another not very long road, Cannon Smith Drive, is a log house built in 1847. The local Historical Society's research found that the original owner was a John Fulford, who had received a 500-acre grant of land for his labor on the Rideau Canal. The rear part of the house was rebuilt with original logs in 1982. Both of these log houses you've just seen were built with the single gable style of roof. There are many log houses in Fitzroy Township that have been covered with siding, but those that have not are in scattered locations. This one, in the far west of the township, still has its original logs, but has been well adapted to modern living by a tasteful addition. The original part of this house was built during the 1840s, and the original deed to this property is actually dated 1829. The fact that the log houses show up in many parts of the township tells us that the settlers were spread around and were probably quite isolated except for those where small villages grew up. The last example of an original log house I want to show you is where settlement first began in Fitzroy Township, and that was in Fitzroy Harbour. This 1.5-story log structure was built in 1855, and it was home to 4 generations of sheriffs who were the founders of Fitzroy Harbour. A rear kitchen was added in 1972, but otherwise the building reflects its original look. It's a simple rectangular structure, easy to build for pioneers. The original builder was Robert Sheriff, who came with his father Charles and brother Alexander and settled near Chats Falls in 1819. Chats Falls was the magnificent set of falls and small islands that existed at this point on the Ottawa River before the Chats Falls Dam was built. It was here that Charles Sheriff settled after receiving a land grant of 4,500 acres in Fitzroy Township, given to him by Governor-General Lord Dalhousie, who wanted him to develop a settlement on the Ottawa River above Bytown and to explore the possibilities of an inland waterway that would go from the sea to Georgian Bay. As far as we can surmise, Charles built a stone house by the river, but it was later occupied by his son, Robert Sheriff, and when W.H. Bartlett was passing through Ontario, he painted a view from this house in 1842. There is a plaque in Fitzroy Provincial Park marking the spot where the house was built. It was called Point House, and it is assumed it was probably destroyed by fire, and now only stone rubble remains behind the plaque. A large display board nearby tells the story of Chats Falls and some of the history of the river. Today, the view from the plaque marking the location of the home has changed, but it would still be a wonderful location for a home with a beautiful view. Fitzroy Provincial Park leads us into Fitzroy Harbour, which is the last of the 3 villages still functioning in Fitzroy Township. The village has several buildings of historical and architectural interest. On Piggott Street sits this 2-story home that has an attic. It has a post and beam frame and was built in the 1880s. A side porch was added in the same period and a front veranda in 1991. It served as the Fitzroy post office from the early 1900s to the 1940s. Houses often served as post offices rather than having a special building built. The same was true of this 1.5-story post and beam house built around 1876. It also served as Fitzroy Harbour's post office, but from the 1940s to around 1963. Vinyl siding was applied in the 1980s, and the home was awarded a century designation in 2000. Fitzroy Harbour also has 3 historic churches, which is somewhat surprising given the fact that the village is not very large and was never a wealthy community. But over the years, populations declined in other areas of the township, and various mergers of congregation took place, so that Fitzroy Harbour now has the majority of functioning churches in the whole township. The first one we can look at is Bethel St. Andrew's United Church. This is a substantial stone church built between 1855 and 58, and it began life as a Scottish Presbyterian church, and its structure followed the traditional Presbyterians of the day, with a high central pulpit reached by a semicircular stairway on either side. And the stonemason was Mr. William Gray of Torbolton, and he built walls that were 30 inches thick. There was no place for an organ or choir in the first version of the church, as these were considered frivolous. The old high pulpit and stairways were removed in the early 1900s, and the church chose to become part of the United Church in 1925, when that denomination was formed. An addition for a Sunday school was added between 1959 and 64, and a narthex made from stone was added in 1982. St. Michael's Roman Catholic Church built its first church in 1849. The congregation was scattered, and its priests used to arrive for the services on horseback. But fire destroyed this building in 1854, so the people decided to build a new church at the heart of the village, and they completed the new stone building by 1861. The church spire and the bell, which are so prominent, were blown down during a severe storm in 1984, but they were in place again by 1986. Construction of the third church, St. George's Anglican, began in 1857, but the congregation was small and going through hard times. By 1863, they had only collected enough money to complete the foundation and the walls, but there was no roof, no pews, and no heat. It took courage to be an Anglican in Fitzroy Harbour in those days. Still, they persevered, and 1863 is considered the church's construction date. The completed building was consecrated in 1872. It's a stone building in Gothic Revival style, and the church hall was added in 1968. Changing demographics and a decline in populations meant that a number of churches closed in the township, but St. George's, which had such a struggle to be built, has endured, and today it serves Woodlawn, Constance Bay, and Fitzroy Harbour. Fitzroy Township has 3 other things to measure, none of which is built heritage, but all of which have heritage implications. The first is Morris Island, in the past a gathering place for First Nations people who used the Ottawa River as their highway. And from the 1880s to the 1930s, it was the site of a lead mine. It was turned into a conservation area in 1987, operated by the Mississippi Valley Conservation Authority. This collection of islands and various types of terrain is a haven for walkers, kayakers, and canoeists who come every year to enjoy nature in its natural state. The second treasure is Fitzroy Provincial Park, already mentioned in relation to Charles Sheriff, the founder of Fitzroy Harbour. It's a large swath of land fronting on the Ottawa River that provides camping, a large beach, and wonderful river views to the hundreds of people who visit the park every year. Both of these areas are heritage landscapes, each with its own history, and protected natural areas play just as important a role as built heritage in preserving the history of our country. The last item is a treasure many Ottawans have enjoyed for generations. It is the Quillon Ferry. It takes people from the Fitzroy Harbour dock on Ferry Road over to Quillon, Quebec and back again. Today it is a car ferry, but when it started out around 1865, it was a raft rowed by two men. Then it became a ferry moved by a horse on a treadmill, and later was powered by a horse that moved in a circle. Engine power didn't come until 1916, when a Fairbanks Morse gasoline engine replaced the horse. In keeping with the modern age, the ferry is now cable-operated and electric-powered with 2 battery packs charged overnight. The Quillon Ferry has been associated with Fitzroy Township since it began its trek across the river, and it's a heritage transportation link to be cherished. In conclusion, the built heritage of Fitzroy Township is truly remarkable in that so many houses of architectural interest have been preserved and are still lived in today. I've showed you only a fraction of them, certainly worth protecting. My hope is that this rural area, which represents our pioneer past, will remain unspoiled and retain the peace and beauty which characterizes its present state, and is such a contrast to the unbridled growth happening in the urban areas of Ottawa. We need stronger protection for farmland and more heritage designations on some of its buildings to help maintain this valuable cultural treasure. It used to be that we had local architectural conservation advisory committees in many individual communities whose members took note of heritage properties and worked to protect them. But once the rural townships were amalgamated into Ottawa, these disappeared to be replaced now by a single built heritage subcommittee for the whole city. It seems to me that there's a role for Heritage Ottawa, or there could be a role, to provide heritage education in these rural communities, and Heritage Ottawa could be a catalyst for encouraging local people to take the action necessary to protect the heritage treasures they have in their own neighborhoods.
I'm Carolyn Quinn, and I just want to take a moment before we go into the Q&A session to thank Barbara for this wonderful presentation. Indeed, you have taken us on a lovely journey of discovery through rural Ottawa. Some of these places I recognize, some of the names, and certainly that Quillon Ferry brought lots of memories back for me. But I think it's an important reminder to us that our city is quite vast, as you indicated at the very beginning of the lecture, and is really chock full of beautiful heritage places. And we often don't take the time, I think, to stop and pause and consider these places. So I know I certainly appreciate this because I'm already envisioning some drives this summer out to the more rural areas. This will be, we are recording it and it will be posted. So we can all go back and look at it and take notes and check on where we would like to drive. So Barbara, thank you very much. And I think Heritage Ottawa really appreciates the opportunity to showcase some of the more rural parts of our city. So thank you again.
Welcome. It was a pleasure to do it.
I'd like to open the questions. I have one myself. I noticed in the course of the presentation, a number of the houses that you were talking about, you refer to them having something called century designations. And I'm just wondering, can you tell us a bit more about what those designations mean and if they carry any real protection with them?
Well, the century designation is nice to have. And people usually have something they put on their house that says a century designation, or like the Eastman farm where they have it right on their sign on their farm. But it doesn't, in fact, give any protection to the farm or to the home. It's just lovely to have. But no. You really have to have the heritage designation, which comes through the Ontario heritage designation. And if you notice, there were a couple of homes that were referred that way, like the very first one we saw, it's properly designated under the Heritage
Act, yeah.
Act, yes. So there are many of them that aren't thing. And the other thing I would say is that seems that people are afraid of having a heritage designation often. They think that it's going to prevent them from doing anything, but often the heritage designation is for the exterior. It's not the interior. So you can have a beautifully done home inside, but you have the heritage house outside.
Indeed. I was wondering that. I was wondering if that the century designation was an attempt to recognize the heritage without tying people to any perceived restraint that a designation could impose. And I think that tells us at Heritage Ottawa that indeed there is some awareness raising to do in that regard, as you point out. I have a question here. Are there any remaining heritage commercial buildings in some of the towns and villages, like the general stores or?
Yes, there are. There's the general store, I think even in Fitzroy Harbour is a heritage building. So
Right.
there are a few heritage commercial buildings, but not that many, because really it was an agricultural area. So basically you would have just a general store or something like that.
Right. And post offices were often in people's homes, in the front room or something.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. It's certainly also, if somebody has asked a question, and I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer it because there were a few I think houses that kind of meet this description, but the builder or the original owner of the gray stone home with the blue door, if you know the one that they might be referring to, I'm not sure.
Blue door. No, I mean, there were two on Diamondview Road. One of them is designated as a heritage building, and it's the one where they actually did the restoration inside and outside. And they've kept they changed the entrance to 1858 to suit it. I don't know if that's.
Yes, yeah. Do you remember who the owners were? Or
I don't. Who the original owner was?
I think that's the question. Yes, the builder or original owner. Yeah, that is the question.
I can try to look that up quickly. There's one. Yes, okay. That was the one that I think built in 1840 by Thomas Green, who would have been one of the early settlers in the area.
All right, Thomas Green. Okay, well, I hope that answers that question. Mm-hmm. A lot of nice compliments, Barbara, I have to say, are coming in. The one question here, my understanding is that St. George's Anglican Church will end its service as a church in December of this year due to the declining congregation. Her question here is, can churches be maintained by the township and repurposed as community centers or other uses once, I guess, the building's been deconsecrated?
Well, if it's been, it has to be officially deconsecrated by the diocese before can happen. Once that happens, well, for instance, there's the church in Munster, the Saint. It was deconsecrated. It is now the Munster branch of the public library, and it still has its beautiful stained glass window in it. It has several pieces of furniture and so on that were in the original church as part of the library. And the Historical Society, the Goulburn Historical Society, we did photographs of, enlarged photographs of their historic stuff and gave them those photographs, which they have put on their wall. So the heritage of that church is very much appreciated, but it is used as a public library. And we know that St. Bridget's in downtown Ottawa became a cultural center, an Irish, for Irish culture. Unfortunately, it's for sale these days, but.
Yes. Yeah, no, I mean, finding a new function is is key to saving historic buildings. There's no doubt about it. Being able to transition and adapt to new use is often what saves it. Somebody else also asked about the possibility of mapping some of these places so that that they could be, you know, a route. So that's maybe something that we could we could talk about. Pardon?
Oh, a driving tour, yes.
Yes, exactly.
Well, we have that one for Goulburn Township. We have a driving tour of Goulburn Township. So we'll have to speak to the Fitzroy Historical Society. They do a driving tour.
Yes, absolutely. Well, yeah, maybe we could partner with them to set something up, Heritage Ottawa. Then I have another point here. It's not so much of a question. The Morris Island Conservation Area, like the Mill of Kintail and its museum and walking trails in Lanark County, are under threat by legislation passed by the Ontario government, which will prevent conservation authorities from spending municipal levy money on anything other than their core mandate of water conservation. So that is a new development that I suspect a lot of people aren't aware of. It's more information about this is available on the Mill of Kintail website for people who might be interested in finding out more about that. So yes, that is a significant change. Somebody has shared a little information about another adaptive reuse of churches, and the example is in Halifax, Nova Scotia. An interesting article in the Halifax Examiner about some churches in Nova Scotia that have found new uses. So we could read that and perhaps be inspired.
One thing I wanted to comment on was that I think people in Canada generally seem to be afraid of having anything listed or designated. They're afraid that something won't happen. And yet in the UK, a listed house is valued more highly. And the same thing, even in the United States, there's, when you see a house, a historic house, a lot is made of it, you know, whereas we seem to not want to have a heritage designation. But I think the fear needs to be changed.
You know, it's a cultural, yeah, no, definitely. There's a cultural issue at play here. People are concerned, you know, that they err on the side of caution, protecting, you know, private property rights. The assumption that something negative is going to result from this, whereas in fact, as you point out, it's usually the reverse. And we've seen there've been a number of studies, especially a couple of good ones that have come out of the University of Waterloo, looking at property values inside designated heritage conservation districts in Ontario. And in fact, their studies have shown that property values have gone up because people actually are seeking these kinds of areas that have they feel there's some assurance that the character of their neighborhood is going to be protected. So there's greater value, and they're sought after. So you're right, Barbara. We need to keep working on raising awareness. One more here. Is there a cost for structural value with maintaining heritage status? So I don't know if you want to tackle that. I think usually what happens is, I certainly know within the city of Ottawa, the city's heritage staff are very, very good about working with owners of designated heritage buildings to find ways and means of preserving the heritage elements of buildings in a cost-effective way as possible. And many times it's about finding the right contractor, because most contractors' comfort zone is not to deal with an historic property. And their preference is to say, you know what, if you just rip that out, I could come in with something new and away we go. Whereas there are people coming out of conservation trades programs in greater numbers now who are perfectly qualified to handle historic elements and on buildings, and they know exactly what to do in ways that are not super expensive, but it's because they know how to approach them. So yeah, there are ways of handling these things. But I think we can probably wrap it up. If there's anything that you feel I haven't captured in the comments and questions, please fire it off to us in an email at info@heritageottawa.org, and we will share them with Barbara and we will get back to you. But I would again like to thank you, Barbara, my colleague on the board, who has given us all such a lovely evening presentation. And finally, as Catherine mentioned at the beginning of our lecture, we do provide these talks free of charge, and we do encourage you to join the organization if you are not yet a member, and to donate to the organization to help us continue in our efforts to share heritage stories. Information is available on our website again. And with that, a good night, and thank you everyone, to Barbara and all of you who joined us this evening. Good night.